Hello and welcome back to Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L, Jason Liuzzi, and today is the crossover episode that no one asked for. That today's video is for my 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. My 7th graders who are covering holy orders just so happens to line up perfectly with some questions that were asked by my 8th graders. So we're going to do that. I'm going to answer some commonly asked questions about the priesthood. And these are some real big ones, some real classic ones, and they have to do with why women aren't allowed to be priests and why priests can't be married. Like I said, these are very common, very typical questions to ask, and there's a lot that I could say, and there's a lot more that we could get into, and there's a lot more that we could talk about. But I'm just going to kind of give, I think, a brief and I think concise way of looking at these issues and understanding them a little bit more. So we're going to start off why women aren't allowed to be priests. Or the question is actually this: why aren't women allowed to be priests and deacons? All right, so first of all, within the Catholic Church, right, we like to do things that Jesus did, right? We don't want to do things that Jesus didn't do, and that's why we always look to Christ and his example for all things. We'll get into this a little bit more about, with kind of the role of the priest and things like that within this. But we'll get to that in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself here real quick. So Jesus, right off the bat, we know that Jesus ordained only men. All right, and a lot of people might look at that and say, well, hang on a second. He only did that because of the times he lived in and all that kind of stuff. And that's maybe true, but the big thing to take away from that is that Jesus did all kinds of things that were radically countercultural, that were radically, I would even say scandalous at that time, right? I mean, we have the story of the woman at the well, right, in which Christ just has a conversation with the Samaritan woman at a well. And we read that and we think, oh yeah, Jesus was talking to some woman at a well, but that was a radically scandalous situation, right? The fact that he was talking to a woman in public, that's a big deal. The fact that he's talking to a Samaritan woman as a Jew, also incredibly scandalous. And like I said, we read these things and we think, oh, come on, it's not that big of a deal. But it really was a big deal. I mean, countless times, right? How often do we see Jesus eating dinner with sinners, and prostitutes, tax collectors, things like that? Like things that within the framework of that society was viewed as horrible, that was radically scandalous, right? So if Jesus wanted to do something, he would have. So, to me, that argument falls flat, because if Jesus wanted to do something radical, he would have done something radical, because he did it all the time. So, right off the bat, we don't ordain women because Jesus didn't, but we'll get into that a little bit more, kind of going from there, because I want to play this out a little bit. So, if Jesus wanted to ordain women, right, in my mind, and this is all hypothetical, right? But in my mind, if I was Jesus and I wanted to ordain a woman as a priest or ordain women as priests, I would have obviously ordained my mother, who was perfect, right? Without sin. Duh, right? Because, I mean, in theory, right? In theory, wouldn't she have been the perfect person to be a priest because she is without sin? Wouldn't she have been the perfect person to lead and guide? I mean, certainly in theory, right? This is all hypothetical, but in theory, better than Peter, right, who denied Christ 3 times? Wouldn't the Blessed Virgin Mary be a great selection to be the leader of the church? I mean, if nothing else, she's also, directly, literally related to Christ. I don't know. For me, if I was Christ and I wanted to ordain women, I would have started with my mother. And why wouldn't you? And what I would say is, well, he didn't. And because he didn't, that really tells us something, right? That Jesus did what he did for a reason. And for us to now go back and say, oh yeah, well, although Jesus didn't do it, we want to do it because of X, Y, and Z. When we start doing things because we want to do them and not because Christ did it, that's when we get into trouble. Right? That's when we start, when you really look at things, you say, I mean, is that even right? if Jesus was here today, would he be okay with that? I mean, these are things that we don't necessarily know, so all we can do is look back at what Christ did and try to imitate that. So, like I said, there's a lot more we can get into, but a really interesting thing that I want to talk about, and I need to make a lot of distinctions here when I talk about it, but the question did say, why aren't women allowed to be priests or deacons? What's really interesting, if we look at the ancient church, we actually see that there were deaconesses, right? Now, a deaconess is a deacon who's a woman, but there's a number of things that we need to take note of. One, this wasn't sacramental, that they didn't receive a sacrament, that it was more or less a title. Additionally, they didn't help out with regards to the Mass or the sacraments, right? Whereas deacons would be present, like on the altar, right, at the altar, right, with the priests. Deaconesses were not, right? So that's an important thing. So it wasn't sacramental. And when I say that, what I'm saying is that there's absolutely no proof, right, in writing, in Scripture, out of Scripture, anything like that, that suggests that a deaconess was ever actually ordained, right? That in that sacramental sense, right? That there were deaconesses, we know about them. However, there was no sacramental kind of basis or sacramental grace involved or anything like that. So that's a thing. And the reason why, we would say, well, then why did they have them if it wasn't a sacrament? Once again, we have to understand the culture of that time, right? That, as I was saying before with the woman at the well, right? That men didn't really ever talk to women that weren't like directly in their family. And that was a very cultural thing. So they would have deaconesses who would minister, especially to widows and things like that, who needed to be administered, have sacraments given to them in the sense of like delivering the Eucharist to people, not actually performing sacraments, but then also guiding and helping and talking to them. One way that we really see the deaconess being used was when women specifically were entering the church, especially widows, right? That widows who were entering the church and going through what we would understand as the RCIA process, right? That the deaconess would be someone that guides them and leads them and teaches them and does all that. Once again, that's just a cultural thing, right? That it was appropriate. It was more appropriate, rather, to have a woman do those things and kind of minister to a woman on that behalf, and in that way. I think a really good way of thinking about it is the deaconess at that time would be like the equivalent of like a nun or a religious sister, right? Someone who is set apart from kind of the laity, right? Us, the normal people, if you will, of the church, the lay people. Set apart, certainly, but not having received the sacrament. And that's really important, right? Set apart, yet not belonging to this group who've received the sacrament. So I just wanted to leave you with that, right? So why don't we do it? Well, because Jesus didn't do it. And if Jesus wanted to do it, why wouldn't he have ordained his mother, right? That she would have seemingly been the perfect candidate for that. So with that being said, that's now understand there's many other explanations. That's just one, right? One explanation, just in my head, which seems to be the most practical. Now moving on to the next question. Next question is, why can deacons be married but not priests? It's a great question. And there's a few things we have to break down here, right? That within the Catholic Church, there are two rites. That's R-I-T-E, rites. All right? And at least two main rites. And we have the Latin rite, which is the Roman Catholic Church, right, which is what I belong to and what many of my students belong to, right? And then we have the Eastern Rite churches, which are like the Byzantine churches and things like that. And in the Byzantine Eastern rites, right, and there are several of them, in the Eastern Rite churches, priests actually can be married. So, and remember, those are Catholic churches. They're Eastern Rite Catholic churches, okay? And in the Eastern Rite, they can be married. Now, we'll get into how that works in a bit. So right off the bat, why can't priests be married? Well, they can. It just depends on what rite you belong to. So in the Latin Rite, it's seldom done. However, there are priests, Catholic priests in the Roman Rite, the Latin Rite, that are married. And the reason for that is that they were ministers in a different denomination. In other denominations, they can be married. So they were a minister in a different denomination, and then they became Catholic. And then the church will recognize some of those ordinations. It doesn't recognize and say, "Oh, you were a priest before." They kind of reordain them. But that's an exception, right? A lot of Anglican priests who then later become Catholic can actually can be ordained Catholic priests even though they're married and have children, although that's obviously much less common. So, right off the bat, in the Latin Rite, the vast majority of priests are not married. The vast, vast, vast majority, right? And we have to ask ourselves why. Well, off the bat, remember that priests are imitating Christ. Right? That they are like Christ for us and to us on this earth. And Christ, as we know, was never married, right? There's literally zero evidence to support anything like that. Although it makes for good fiction, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest anything like that. So, our priests today practice what we call celibacy, right? And celibacy is different than chastity. But celibacy is a choice to abstain from marriage and marital relations and things like that, right? So it's a priest chooses, right, to not engage in marriage. Now, in not holy orders, but in religious orders, okay, so like Franciscans, Dominicans, okay, Benedictines, right, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and that chastity is a vow of celibacy, right? That they're vowing that. In diocesan priesthood, they don't necessarily take a vow like that, but they do make a promise to be chaste and celibate. So why do they practice celibacy? Well, we have to understand holy orders within like its greater sacramental context. So, as you know, there are sacraments of initiation, sacraments of healing, and then there's sacraments of service. So matrimony or marriage and holy orders are sacraments of service. They're sacraments in which a person is called to serve. Now within a marriage, right, a husband and wife are called to serve one another, right, and help one another get to heaven. For a priest who receives holy orders, right, they are called to be a service to the church and help get their church to heaven. Okay? So in a way that a husband and wife are married, a priest is symbolically married to the church. Right? And that's a really important kind of distinction to make, right? That in a marriage, a man and a woman, they make vows to one another. Right? And in holy orders, a priest is making his vows to the church. Right? And that's why sometimes you'll see priests that wear wedding rings and things like that, and the reason for that is that they recognize within themselves that they are in a sense married to the church, that their life is a life of profound service. And just like I said, there's a lot we could get into with that, but like I said, just as a husband is called to love and serve and be of service to his wife, so a priest is called to love and be of service to the church. So from where I'm sitting, right, if it's a husband's job to give everything he has to his marriage and everything he has to his wife and everything he has to his family, right, and just be this gift of self, and a priest is called to do that exact same thing for his church, as a married man, I can't imagine doing that, giving all of myself for my family and my wife, and also giving all of myself to the church. For me personally, I feel like it's one of those things, and this is me personally speaking, right, that I don't know how I could do both well. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of take away from this, that it's not just, like choosing a job. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this for work, I'm going to do that for... No, this is a truly deep call to something great and profound. And that's one of the reasons why I think our seminary process, right, the process in which a person goes from being a lay person to a priest, is so long. And that whole time they're praying about and discerning if this is what God's calling them to. you know, in the same way that you don't just like get married to someone just because you meet them for the first time. It's like, no, you date and you get to know each other, and then after a period of time, you know, you mutually together choose to do this thing, right? To get married and you know, to engage in that sacrament and that kind of a thing. So, like I said, a husband and a priest in a lot of ways have that same call to service, although it does look different. But as the question says, why can deacons be married? Now, understanding why deacons can be married, it actually goes back really to the most ancient of the church, and that we see that married deacons were something that kind of always existed. And that's a really important distinction, right? And understanding that deacons are you know, when we're talking about the sacrament of holy orders, that deacons do not share the same responsibilities as a priest, right? Deacons cannot hear confessions. Deacons cannot say the mass. Deacons cannot do all of these things, and that's very intentional, right? But part of that is that we do have to remember that in order to be married and a deacon, you have to first be married. So if you are going to become a deacon, right, and you also want to be married, right, then you need to be married first and then become a deacon. And we have to remember that another really interesting thing is that if a married man becomes a deacon, if his spouse dies before him, he actually can't remarry. There's very rare circumstances where that potentially could happen, but realistically it doesn't. And so in the same way, our deacons are called to celibacy. You know, in that, yes, they're called to celibacy in the sense that in the event that their spouse dies and they're still alive, that they're called to remain celibate. And that's kind of a really big deal, right? Because they do make this promise that our priests do as well, although it does look differently. And going back to what I was saying about the Eastern Rite Church and how priests can be married in the Eastern Rite Church, it's the same thing, right? That in the Eastern Rite Church, if you want to become a priest, right, but you also want to be married, well, then you need to be married before you become a deacon and then a priest. And it's the same thing with them, right? If their spouse dies, they can't remarry and all that. But anyway, I think I covered everything. I hope that answers your questions. If you have additional questions, and I'm sure you do, please feel free to follow up in the comments below. Feel free to reach out to me, all those kinds of things. I'd love to continue talking about this. This has been a good time. This has been Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L, Jason Liuzzi. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Cheers.